Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Apache Arms in Scottsdale, Arizona, taking a look at a couple of interesting guns out of their reference collection. And today we have an Apache Arms carbine. As you can probably pretty clearly see, this is intended to be a knockoff of a Thompson submachine gun, but it is a closed-bolt semi-auto piece, and it was designed to be much cheaper than a Thompson gun. Now, what's really interesting to me about this is not so much its construction, which is laughably crude, but it's also mechanically really interesting once you think about what they were trying to do with this gun. So we'll take it apart, obviously, in just a minute, but this was developed by the same people that had just previously, like the year before, in some ways the same year, 1968, designed and marketed and manufactured this Spitfire carbine. Now, the Spitfire was another gun of this exact same sort of idea. It is a Thompson lookalike semi-auto, but the Spitfire, well, I have a full video on the Spitfire. If you're interested in it, check that out. I'll link to it in the description below. Ultimately, on the Spitfire, people discovered that if you held the safety down and pulled the trigger, it would jam the disconnector and it would just work like a machine gun. And ATF saw this and deemed the gun to be a machine gun, which is an interesting application of law that, well, there's a paper that Matt LaRosiere from Floodbusters did on the interpretation of gun laws, and in particular has a section on the Spitfire and how this may or may not have been a legally appropriate, technically appropriate decision at the time, but it was enforced. De facto was the law. The Spitfires all became registered or controlled machine guns. Some of them were registered, but this was a gun where the registration cost was higher than the actual cost of the firearm, so a lot of them were just destroyed or turned in or scrapped. And the people who were responsible for it turned around, created a brand new company, and attempted to basically make the same gun, but to make it acceptable to ATF by changing around the fire control system. And that's what we have with the Apache. Now, the really easily distinctive feature that differentiates the two is that the Apache uses a square steel receiver tube here, where the Spitfire used a round tube, and I'm sure that was done just to make sure that you couldn't interchange any of the parts, because most of the other parts are not identical, but very, very similar. They use the same castings for the front grip. They used original Thompson wood for the buttstock, and the casting here for the trigger magazine well assembly, the lower assembly, looks like it's basically the same casting that they used for the Spitfire, just with some aesthetics on the grip changed. So with that in mind, what we have here is a 1968 semi-automatic closed-bolt 45 ACP carbine. Let's zoom in and let me show you how it works and what they did to make this an as cheap as possible semi-auto that would meet legal requirements. This whole business plan is essentially based on, if you squint a little bit, or if you're not really a super nerdy gun person, this is sure looks like a Tommy gun. And Tommy guns are cool, and therefore we'll sell something that looks like a Tommy gun. Not exactly the world's finest roll markings here. No, these are some sort of hand-stamped markings. We've got Apache Arms Company out of Tempe, Arizona, very clearly marked semi-auto. Patent pending, not sure exactly what they were patenting on this, but 45 caliber model and serial number. I don't think that they actually made 2,800 of these. I don't know where the number started. I don't know where they ended, but these are not particularly common guns to find today because the business didn't last very long, and I think you'll understand why when we take a closer look inside. So for controls, we have two buttons. The front button here is the magazine release. Push that in and you can pull out the mag. And what that's doing is just pushing in this catch right there. Thompson gun magazines have this sort of T-slot on the back, and they have a much more complex locking insertion mechanism than traditional normal magazines. So Apache went ahead and used grease gun magazines instead. These were available on the surplus market at the time. They were cheaper, and they were a heck of a lot easier to design a cheap gun around. So 45 ACP, that's all that these were ever made in. You got a 30-round mag from a grease gun. It looks like these require maybe a little bit of fitting, but that would be because of the inaccuracies of the Apache lower and manufacturing, not because of any problem with grease gun mags in general. And the one other control is this guy, which is a crossbolt safety. So push that across, blocks the trigger on this side, it will fire. One of the neat things about this is we can pretty much identify where every different component on it came from. So this is an original piece of Thompson submachine gun wood. This would have come from one of the late military Thompsons, the M1 or the M1A1, because it's not set up like a quick detach stock like the early Colt Thompsons were. But Apache, while they got the wood, they didn't get all of the fittings. So what they have done is screwed in a little piece of plastic to fill the sling slot. Their butt plate is a real sort of cheap, commercially, make up some cheap and easy butt plates, a couple of flathead wood screws to hold them in place, kind of hand file it around the edge to fit nicely. And the reinforcing bolt here is not a reinforcing bolt, it's just a little screw and some washers to, again, fill the holes in the original wood. The muzzle device here is cast aluminum. It's got the front sight and the front sight wings, and it's got some ribs to it to make it look kind of sort of like a cuts compensator. The barrel comes all the way out to here, and this casting is just sleeved over it and then held in place by those two little set screws. The front grip is pretty much the same thing. It's just a piece of aluminum casting, rough finish, held in place by a set screw right there. We can actually see that it's hollow inside. Pretty simple. Exact same grip as far as I can tell that they used on the Spitfires. Then the lower housing is actually based on sort of the Thompson style, where it's the whole length of the receiver. It has the fire control group in it. It has the grip actually molded into it here. This is also cast aluminum. It's got the magazine well, and it is attached to the upper receiver by 3 socket head screws right here. So this, I wish I had a Spitfire side by side with this to see if these castings are exactly the same. The grips look a little bit different on the Spitfire. I suspect it's the exact same mold and they just made some modifications for the grip. Let's go ahead and take it apart and see what's inside. So we just got these 3 screws. Those 2 let us take off the buttstock. And then that one comes out. And then we can just drop this thing off the upper assembly. Next up, the spring is inside the rear of the receiver here. In order to get it out, we have to take out this screw, which also holds on the rear sight. So be aware, every time you wanted to actually disassemble this thing, you would have to re-zero it, because that's also how you adjust your windage, by the way, is open, unscrew this, slide this side to side, and then tighten it back down. That is totally not super janky and dumb. This screw is going to hold the rear block in place. Let that expand out. And then we get the rear end cap. Hole goes all the way through it. We get the rubber buffer, the spring, and I am actually very happy to see that they used a large diameter spring. That's easy to reassemble because it's not going to kink in the receiver. Then we can pull the bolt handle back to there, pull the bolt handle out. We've got an end plug at the front end of the spring, and then the bolt assembly itself. All right, let's take a closer look at some of these parts, because oh boy, are they pretty awful. So the receiver is a piece of flat tube that was bent into a square and just welded in a couple of places, not everywhere, just 4 welds there. There is a trunnion welded in place that the barrel is screwed into. If you look really close there, you can see the threads on the back of the barrel. The ejector is a fixed ejector right there, and it is just screwed in. So this is the ejector plate, this is the block that holds it in place, connected up to the trunnion, and then 2 screws that hold it all together. And that's it for the receiver tube. We have holes top and bottom here so that you can have 2 screws to hold this rear plug in place. One of those screws comes in from the top, locks in the rear sight. The other comes in from the bottom and locks in the butt plate. The bolt itself is also extremely simple. This would have been made from a single block of material, The extractor is just this spring steel piece here, screwed into the front of the bolt. This does actually follow the general shape of a Thompson bolt, which is a little bit impressive. We have a firing pin down in there with a firing pin spring. So there you go. It is spring-loaded, that's good. That's a nice safety feature. And you can see that there's a flat cut on the firing pin. That is there so that when the bolt handle is in place, the bolt handle actually acts as the limiter on travel of the firing pin. So kind of essentially the bolt handle acts like a cross pin there. Now, you may be wondering how you take the firing pin out, and the answer is you can't. The way they manufactured this is they had their block of steel, they did all the fitting on the outside, including a slot here for the ejector, and then they took an end mill and just ran it all the way through to here to create the slot for the hammer to come up inside. You may notice, like think about this, the opening in an AR-15 bolt, that's there for the hammer to have a place to go. So this is the open slot for the hammer. They put in the firing pin spring and then the firing pin, and then they put this block in the back and weld it in place. It is not removable. And in fact, if we look at the parts list here, bolt firing pin and pin spring sold only as a unit. Do not attempt to remove the firing pin from the bolt. They are pre-assembled at the factory in order to make the whole thing a little bit simpler and cheaper to make. All right, and now let's take a look at the lower assembly. This is an aluminum casting again. And to me, it's the fire control system that's really interesting here, but the fire control system is really the only thing that's actually in there. What they have done is build a fire control grip almost entirely into the trigger itself. So if you're familiar with the AK or AR hammers, or M1 Garand hammer, you will recognize that there are two catches on this hammer, one in the front, one in the back. And the idea here is that if the trigger has been pulled, you can see I can pull the trigger forward, then nothing will hook on that bottom catch surface, but it will catch on the front one. If the trigger is being held down, that's essentially your semi-auto disconnector, because it latches in like that. Then when I release the trigger, you get that little click and the hammer moves just slightly. That is it releasing the back sear catch and engaging the front sear catch on the front sear in the trigger. Now if I pull the trigger, it's just going to fire. This is essentially the same mechanism that you will find in an M1 or an AR or an AK, especially an AK. This is M1/AK style here. But it's been made entirely out of the cheapest possible folded bits of sheet steel. Now they have done another thing here, which is to cut this loop or this curve inside the hammer, and that is there to appease ATF. Or rather, I should say, to appease the IRS, because this thing predates the existence of ATF. This is a letter that Apache got back from the IRS. So they have made a modification to fully weld what they call a firing pin block in here so that it cannot be easily removed. And IRS has approved that as being semi-automatic and legal for them to sell. Remember, this is coming on the heels of the Spitfire carbines being deemed machine guns. So what Apache was first and foremost concerned about was making sure that they didn't have the same thing happen with this gun. Note, we also have an original piece of documentation here from them submitting a gun to the HP White Labs, who has tested it. Serial numbers 1568 and 69, and determined that there's no way to make this thing fire full auto like the Spitfire could. Now, the intention of this concave section in the hammer, I believe, is so that the hammer will catch up here on the bolt if you mess with the disconnector and allow it to just have the hammer follow. The idea being you get rid of the back piece so that when you pull the trigger, nothing catches on this rear sear, or if you were to grind off that rear sear surface. If you do that, the hammer will just continue to go back and forth, but instead of waiting until the bolt is in place to fire, it will just travel with the bolt and it will hook right there and jam the whole gun up if you try to make that modification. And occasionally, even if you don't make the modification, it is worth pointing out one of our other pieces of literature here from Apache Arms. If it stops halfway forward, you pull the trigger and like jiggle it back and let it go real quick. And this is built inside to stop rapid fire should a particular part malfunction. They weren't even willing to tell you why they were putting in there this mechanism. They just really wanted to make sure that they could convince IRS, now ATF, that this couldn't be modified to become a machine gun. Apache Arms didn't last all that long. So it's worth pointing out, Spitfire was based in Phoenix, Apache Arms was based in Tempe, which is essentially just a suburb of Phoenix. It's a city right next door to Phoenix. I don't know the names of the people who were involved, but it seems pretty clear it's the same group of people. They redesigned this, they get they get approval from ATF, but they still weren't really a competent, effective business organization because they pretty quickly went bankrupt. They got a judgment against them from their creditors. They didn't have any money to pay the judgment, and so all of their assets were forfeit to their creditors, and that's actually where this particular gun comes from. One of the lawyers who was involved in suing them for not ATF things, but suing them for business malfeasance and not paying the loans that they owed money on, went down to the shop, and basically there were parts for a whole bunch of guns available, and he and a couple of the other creditors assembled themselves some Apache carbines and took them home as collateral, not as collateral, but as essentially payment in lieu of what they were actually owed. Some of the other creditors took some of the machine tools and other equipment. The guys who were really smart, who figured out what was going on, were the ones who took the stock of original Thompson stocks and grease gun magazines as their payment, because those are the things that actually would have been, well, probably would have gone up in value, would have been worth something. The Apache carbines are rightfully seen as totally junky crap guns. Now it's interesting to look at this. The price list on this shows them as being $169.95 or 99 cents, 170 bucks for a gun in this configuration, the standard config. You could pay more to get it with a scope, which probably nobody did, or to get it with all sorts of more fancy finishes, chrome, gold, engraving, whatever you want, they'd do it for you. But base model, $170 in 1968, which equates to between $1,500 and $1,600 today. So if you want to put this in perspective, I think it aside from the machining and design elements being interesting, this also puts a nice perspective on the availability of civilian firearms today. Because imagine what you can get for $1,500 to $1,600 today on the market for civilian semi-auto closed bolt pistol caliber carbines, and how that compares to this heap. Anyway, big thanks to Bear Arms for giving me access to this from the reference collection to show to you guys. Again, if you're interested in this, definitely check out the Spitfire video. That's the earlier half of this gun's history. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.